The cleaner uncle opened the hidden compartment under the bucket, and a few venomous snakes dived into the pool. The uncle just wanted to leave, but found a snake stuck in the bucket. The uncle was scared, so he turned around and looked at the security guard. Fortunately, he was not discovered, so he put the snake back into the water. Fortunately, he was not found, so he put the snake in the water again. As soon as Shuichi was about to leave, another ambulance came from the opposite side. Both sides were trapped by zombies, and the doctor who came first suddenly pulled out a dagger. As soon as Shuichi was about to leave, another ambulance came from the opposite side. Both sides were trapped by zombies, and the doctor who came first suddenly pulled out a dagger. It turned out that they were in the same group with the uncle cleaner, and they wanted to forcibly pull the man away. They pulled the man to a cabin in the wild. His name is Lee Dushi, a serial killer, and the people who kidnapped him are the family members of the victims of that year. Since the prosecution period of this case has expired, the family members had to resort to this desperate measure to avenge their relatives. Suddenly, the cabin fell into darkness, and in the chaos, Lee Dushi, who was tied back with great difficulty, was rescued, and the one who rescued him was Lao Kui, the policeman in charge of the case that year. The body of his fiancée has not been found yet, and Lee Dushi cannot die yet. He threw Lee Dushi into a hotel and left a note, saying that if he didn't want to die, he should shut up. The next day, Lee Dushi told reporters that the person who kidnapped him was his fan and he would not pursue the matter. The live broadcast was held as scheduled. Lao Kui questioned him in public, why the book only mentioned 10 victims, but not the 11th, unless he was not the murderer at all, but just a liar who took the opportunity to hype. Unexpectedly, Lee Dushi smiled lightly. Just as the two sides were arguing, a viewer called and called himself Mr. J strangely. He asked Lee Dushi right away, but he didn't know how many seconds Lao Kui needed to run 100 meters, and asked him how many moves he could have with Lao Kui. There was an uproar at the scene. How could another murderer appear? Lao Kui immediately asked his colleagues to locate him, but when he arrived, he only found a knife and a videotape. The content of the videotape was the last words of Lao Kui's fiancée before she died, and the dagger was the one that the murderer stabbed Lao Kui with that year, which was enough to prove that Mr. J was the murderer that year. On the other side, Lee Dushi also held a press conference. He claimed that his safe was stolen, and the videotape and dagger were stolen from him by Mr. J. It was difficult to tell the real murderer from the fake one. At this time, Mr. J publicly stated that he would come to the radio station in 3 days to have a three-way confrontation with Lee Dushi and Lao Kui. And at the same time he produced a new piece of evidence. The burial location of the 11th victim. The day of confrontation soon arrived. In order to prove that he was the real serial killer, Mr. J took off his mask and looked at the camera. The director was immediately puzzled and switched the screen to the woods 30 kilometers away. Under the big tree marked by Mr. J, the skeleton of the 11th victim was actually dug out. Mr. J was very proud, and the victim's mother had already burst into tears. The host asked Lee Dushi. Unexpectedly, Lee Dushi suddenly changed his tone and frankly admitted that he was not the murderer. The host was puzzled and asked him how he knew these details of the crime. But Lee Dushi said, it turned out that all this was a trap set by Lao Kui. When he fought with the real murderer for the last time, the other party said this. Lao Kui concluded that the murderer killed people just to get attention and satisfaction. So he spent 2 years writing this book, I Am a Murderer. Lee Dushi is the son of the first victim. He changed his appearance and co-starred with Lao Kui. They firmly believe that the murderer will never watch his halo being taken away. At this time, the murderer still said arrogantly, Lao Kui took out the videotape left by the murderer for the first time. In the last few seconds, the sound of the TV was faintly heard in the video. At that time, the results of the 14th presidential election were being announced. It happened to be 1992, at 2400 on February 19th, and now it is 2007, at 11:46 on February 18th. That is, there are only 14 minutes left before the end of the prosecution period. The murderer finally showed fear. It turned out that he did not kill Lao Kui's fiancée immediately. Instead, he imprisoned and tortured her for 2 years. Later, his fiancée became pregnant with his child. This scumbag buried his pregnant fiancée alive. Lao Kui couldn't suppress his anger and pulled the trigger, but was pushed away by his men, shooting the eye-wave lamp, and the murderer escaped in the chaos. After a desperate chase, Lao Kui finally caught up with him, but the statute of limitations was about to expire. He vented his hatred with punches, but the murderer showed a weird smile, and he couldn't bring him to justice after all. In the chaos, The mother of his fiancée rushed up, and Lao Kui instinctively caught her hand. The murderer became proud again, as if he had long expected that Lao Kui would not break the law. His smile froze in the next second, and a fountain pen full of snake venom was inserted into his chest. And the devil was finally sent to hell. In the end, Lao Kui was sentenced to 5 years for intentional homicide and betrayal. And South Korea also extended the statute of limitations for murder from 15 years to 25 years because of this incident.